Thank you. Thank you, Christian, and thank you to all of our panelists and our members of the media and others who are joining us today for our press conference with elected officials to protect America, California. My name is Dominic Frangillo, council member, retired in the town of Caroline in New York, and co-founder and executive director of Elected Officials to Protect America. And we're so excited to have a illustrious panel here today of elected officials as we call elected officials around the state on this day of statewide action across the state, calling on Governor Newsom to build on his climate leadership to phase out fossil fuel production in California. Elected Officials to Protect California is a coalition of over 430 elected officials across the state that are calling for an end to new permitting for oil and gas drilling in the state and end to neighborhood drilling that's harming public health and our climate. So we are grateful for the leadership of Governor Gavin Newsom on climate issues. However, the urgency of the IPCC report that shows that the window for action is absolutely closing, being now measured in months, and the urgency, as we are seeing in the war in Ukraine, of the urgency to get off of fossil fuels. And our panelists will speak to that today, as we see the cost of fossil fuels from Europe and Ukraine all the way to California, with people losing their lives, 1 in 5 deaths globally caused by fossil fuels. So with that, we'd like to introduce our first panelist, our first speaker, former mayor of San Luis Obispo, Heidi Harmon.
People from San Luis Obispo, a lot wider than our cute little town. So thank you everyone for being here. It's really hot today. I don't know if it's...
No cause for alarm.
No, don't worry. It's 90 degrees out in April. Nobody panic. But thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here for what I see as the defining issue of our time, right? And every day, also in a global sense, right, we see the horrific human toll that the invasion of Ukraine has brought to innocent civilians. And this unfolding tragedy is just one more point in a constellation of sorrows that we see with the fossil fuel industry: wildfire, drought, floods, forced climate migration, and the direct environmental justice impacts of pollution. That shows that we need to rapidly shift away from fossil fuels for our public health and global security. It's clear that dependence on fossil fuels is the engine for Russia's war machine and the leverage Putin wields over countries that are reliant on his fossil fuels. As the war rages on, we are reminded of just how important fighting against all forms of militaristic expansion are for our communities and for Mother Earth. War and the devastation that comes with it, including the continued extraction of fossil fuels and the fight to control them, are calamitous for all peoples. Militaries are the biggest polluters on the planet. And so if we are truly opposed to climate chaos and in favor of climate justice, we must stand against war in all of its forms across all of our collective lands. Yes.
Yeah.
Similarly, we would not have a climate crisis if the world wasn't reliant on fossil fuels. And yet, California is the top oil producer. The state produces some of the dirtiest, most climate damaging oil in the world. Fossil fuel has made California more vulnerable to apocalyptic fires, drought, and deadly heat. Still, the fossil fuel industry continues to extract and burn its products primarily in frontline communities of color. And so while I'm grateful for the leadership of Governor Newsom on some climate issues, he's announced a fracking ban, setback distances on new wells, and electric vehicle plans, this is not coming with the urgency that this issue demands. We are California and we can do better. And doing better, as the governor put it during his State of the State address, means fighting the polluters, because it's the California way. I am the former mayor of San Luis Obispo, and I resigned a short while after I woke up blurry-eyed in the middle of the night to a text from my kid who was worried about the recent dire report on climate change from the IPCC. For the first time in my life, I didn't know how to make my kid feel better. I couldn't tell them that it was going to be okay, that there was no monster under the bed. So I chose to do more at the state level, and now I serve my community working on climate policy at the state to preserve the future for my children and for yours. The changes that we need to address the climate crisis mean fighting the polluters. And let's be clear, they will not go down without a fight. Ensuring healthy air and uncontaminated water for everyone, promoting good union jobs for working families, and making the transition to a renewable energy economy that will protect young people's futures and ours from catastrophic harms. And that's why, when I think of the ongoing environmental injustices in California, I'm reminded of the young people of color living in refinery cities, of how they grow up breathing polluted air and have watched loved ones suffer because of the toxins that they've endured their entire lives. I think about the thousands of school children who go to school where their playgrounds are right up against oil wells, spewing toxins in Kern County, LA, and elsewhere. And too many know the inside of emergency rooms, having woken up in the middle of the night with bloody noses and barely breathing. I think about agricultural workers throughout the state who breathe in oil and gas pollution as they toil the land to feed our nation. And closer to home, right here in SLO County, I think about the Arroyo Grande oil field, which produces some of the most climate damaging oil in the state of California. Residents who live near this field complain of the noise and the smell at all hours of the day and the potential contamination of their water wells. And that is why communities across the state are joining together right now in a statewide day of action as we call on the governor to build on his climate leadership by ending all new fossil fuel permitting now and strengthening the setback rule to include both new and existing oil wells. We can do it, we must do it, and we are already doing it. It wasn't that long ago that you would have been exposed to secondhand smoke just about everywhere you went. Not anymore. Why? Because a cute little town on the central coast of California decided that being able to breathe clean air was important for public health. So they banned smoking in all public places. And that little town was none other than San Luis Obispo. And now that policy is a global phenomenon with significant public health impacts everywhere it goes. We can do that again, and we are doing that again. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the existential threat of climate chaos, but do not despair. Optimism is a political act. Those who benefit from the status quo are perfectly happy for us to do nothing, for us to think that nothing is possible, for us to think that it is too late. But in fact, cynicism is obedience. Cynicism is obedience to a status quo that is killing us all. Active hope is the revolution. And so we begin by imagining the future that we want. We learn from emerging leaders like Chris Smalls, who recently led the successful effort to unionize an Amazon facility, who said of Jeff Bezos, while you are up in space, we are down here organizing. And so while the fossil fuel industry is doubling down on their insidious and murderous tactics, we are organizing. And while some in office care more about their next election than they do about the next generation, we are organizing. And while many tell us that it cannot be done, we say, get out of the way because we are organizing. We see big oil reaping wartime profits for the benefit of investors at the cost of the lives of innocent children and others. And it is heartbreaking. And just as it is heartbreaking to see frontline families who live and go to school right next to toxic fossil fuel facilities having those impacts as well. And this is why ending fossil fuel extraction is not just about ecology, but it's really about the ecology of the human heart. And it is incumbent upon all of us to step up at this critical moment. We must act now if we want to have a chance of ensuring a viable planet. And to rise above this challenge, we must build a more resilient, equitable, and prosperous California. So the task at hand is a big one, the biggest. But we are not called to do everything, but we are called to do something. And to close, as the author Clarissa Piccola Estes beautifully states, ours is not the task of fixing the entire world at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach. So what part of the world is within your reach? Unfurl your wings and do that. At the beginning of the Ukrainian war, President Zelensky stood with his closest supporters to declare that they were still there. They were still here together, fighting for what is right. He said, "Vis mi tut," we are here. Vis mi tut, vis mi tut. We are all here today and every day, reimagining a more beautiful world together. So let's go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Heidi Harmon, live from San Luis Obispo at one of the many statewide rallies around the state of California that are calling on Governor Newsom to step up California's climate leadership. So thank you, Mayor. We will now, and just want to echo her comments about how important it is for us to take leadership in our jurisdictions where we can do it as absolutely as much as possible to protect our people and our planet, given the global crises that we face. And she spoke eloquently about the connection to fossil fuels and the war in Ukraine. That's a great segue to our next speaker, former Berkeley Rent Stabilization Board member and chair of the Democratic Party Environmental Caucus, Igor Tregub. Igor?
Привет. Hello. As a Kiev-born Jewish immigrant, I have experienced in the last 7 weeks a modicum of centuries of intergenerational trauma, but also a sense of purpose, resolve, and a fierce urgency of now. Putin's murderous war has been financed by $285 million from sales of Russian oil on a daily basis. Every day I recoil from images of neighborhoods where I played as a youngster as they go up in flames and are reduced to rubble. The emptiness and loss are hard to express. There are no words in the dictionary of any language to express them. We owe it, however, to our shared humanity to act decisively today. We can help protect democratic nations still reliant on fossil fuels to become energy secure by showing them the way here in these United States of America, and especially in California, in this golden state, because we all know that as goes California, so goes the nation. The horrific invasion of Ukraine shows that we need to rapidly shift away from fossil fuels for our security and for that the security of other nations. It's abundantly clear, especially right now, that dependence on fossil fuels is what fuels Russia's war machine. It's only the leverage that Putin wields over countries that are reliant on fossil fuels that allows this horrific war to drag on. Dictators like Putin make it easier for oil and gas CEOs to price gouge Americans. These executives don't care about our national security or the hardship to their consumers. They don't care that the cost at the pump in our state has surpassed $6. They only care about one thing: profits. Natural gas is the largest source of electricity in the US. It's the heating fuel that Europe depends on for belligerent Russia to supply. It's a major contributor to the climate crisis. I'm thankful that President Biden has worked with Congress to ban the imports of oil, but that is not enough. Right now, or 2 days ago, the American Energy Independence Act has been introduced both in the US Senate and in Congress. This is a bill that addresses US energy independence, the production and import of oil and natural gas, and the rescission of specified environmental requirements. This bill directs the president to develop a plan for the US to achieve energy independence by 2024. It also addresses energy pipelines, and it makes sure that instead we shift resources to democratized renewable sources of energy. And to do that, all you have to do is look at California. We lead the nation in distributed generation. As of today, almost 1,500,000 solar projects, over 12,000 megawatts installed. The Million Solar Roofs project, which started in 2006, has now more than surpassed its goal. Nearly 1.3 million solar roofs have been created. And since 2006, customer solar systems have avoided 22 million metric tons of CO2, which is the equivalent of getting 4 million cars off the road, 16,000 tons of smog pollutants, equivalent to the annual pollution of 3.8 million vehicles, and 360 trillion British thermal units of natural gas, which is the equivalent of the annual consumption of 20 large natural gas-fired power plants. That's right. Through renewables like distributed solar, we have taken 20 peaker plants offline in California. Real energy security is only possible if we break free from oil and gas, crack down on price gouging, and invest in cheaper, cleaner, renewable energy. There are other solutions out there. There's the untapped potential of offshore wind. The National Renewable Energy Lab says that California has an enormous 112 gigawatts of offshore wind. That is technical power potential representing 150% of all of California's current electricity use needs. The solutions are here. Now, we need the political will. I call on Governor Newsom. I call on the legislature. I call on the California Public Utilities Commission. No solar tax. Make solar more affordable and accessible to all, particularly working class and middle class folks, not less. Ensure that California follows over 40 other states in creating setbacks to oil production. This morning, I joined UC Berkeley, my alma mater, Go Bears, some students at UC Berkeley at a rally. This is the fight for their lives, for their future. They are calling on the governor to cease all approvals of new oil production by the end of 2022. And I joined them in that call. In the words of my childhood friend Ksenia, writing to me from her hiding spot, just trying to survive, make an American dream possible for Ukraine today. Slava Ukraini, thank you for all you're doing. Let's ensure that we can save my birthplace and save our planet at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor, and for your really powerful and moving words, and our thoughts and prayers go to all of your friends and family that are still in Ukraine. And appreciate your comments too on just the geopolitical harms that fossil fuels cost. And obviously the world recoiling from all of the senseless deaths. And here, in California, with 34,000 Californians each year, according to a Harvard study, dying from fossil fuels prematurely. And the political will that it takes to stand up to fossil fuels funding the war machine for Putin. And here at home, we're going to go next to a community that's summoned the political will to stand up to the fossil fuel industry here at home to protect lives and protect communities here. So with that, we're going to go to Richmond Councilmember and elected officials to protect California Leadership Council member Eduardo Martinez. Eduardo.
Thank you. here in Richmond, we have 32 miles of shoreline, and that 32 miles is infested with toxic sites. One of those toxic sites is created by Levin Terminal, which has been exporting coal, but we passed an ordinance that will stop that in a few years. The other toxic site is Chevron Refinery. Chevron Refinery is more interested in profits than they are in community or in the environment. They are on strike now. The Steelworkers Local 5 are on strike, and they had asked Chevron to shut the refinery down so that it wouldn't be a hazard to the community. Chevron instead chose to bring in scabs. And since the scabs came in, we have had an unprecedented number of flarings. And a lot of them have gone unreported. For instance, I learned that there was a flaring on the 6th at almost 5 o'clock, and there was no reportage. There was no warning to the community. And this makes me think that government is working with the refinery, because it's their responsibility to let us know that there is a health hazard happening, so that people can take appropriate manners. The report said that BACMED was notified, our police and fire department were notified, and yet we didn't get, BCDC was notified, and yet we got no warning. The public was not notified. That's criminal. And I also learned that the flaring distributed a large amount of sulfur dioxide, which is an acute toxic corrosive. It's also heavier than air, which means that once it's released, it will float down into the community. So I also know that Chevron actually exports a lot of oil. So if we want to be self-sufficient, we shouldn't export so much oil. You know, it's really a shell game where they take oil from one place and ship it to another, so they can say that there's a shortage in one place, and it's all damaging to the community, to the environment, and it's always communities of color, BIPOC communities, who are closest to these toxic sites, to these refineries, who end up suffering the most. It's criminal, and we need to stop it. And the only way we can stop it is to start planning for a just transition. And for that just transition to happen, we can't just wait until we run out of fossil fuels. We need to start doing it now. We need to start planning it so that we can mitigate any of the negative effects that will happen when we transition from fossil fuels to renewables. We need to start figuring out how to make that transition. And we also need to figure out how to pay for the cleanups of all the toxic sites that the oil industry has created. We need to figure out how to clean up the air, the soil, the water, and it's going to take a lot of political will. In fact, when we passed the ordinance on coal, we ended up with 5 lawsuits, 3 at the state level, 2 at the federal level. Luckily, we were able to negotiate to get rid of them, but we need stronger laws, and we're asking Governor Newsom to pass those laws, and not only to pass them, but to enforce them. We have a lot of laws that are passed, and that's what they are. They're just words on paper, and we need more than words on paper. We need action. So So let's do what needs to be done, and make sure that we stop polluting, harming our children, our community members, and we can do that by having a 3,200 foot setback for new oil wells. In fact, we shouldn't have new oil wells. We need to start scaling back. We need to start transitioning. I wish I was as elegant as the first two speakers because they touched my heart. But I am speaking on behalf of my community and all the organizations that we have here in Richmond. Our Power Richmond, which is a alliance of organizations who are working towards a just transition. We have Urban Tilth, who works on urban farming. We have Rich City Rides, which works on transforming from car culture to bicycle and pedestrian culture. We have Safe Return, who works on recidivism, making sure that people from prison can get out of that pipeline and become community members again. We have CBE, which helps young people, helps community members learn about the environmental hazards and teaches them to be active in the community. We have APEN, which works on works with the Asian community. So we have the Sunflower Alliance, which is an alliance of all sorts of organizations focused on environmental health. And that's what we need to do. We need to come together and share our voices as we are here with elected leaders, and spread the word out to everyone else. So I want to thank Dominique for putting this together, and I want to thank everyone else for being part of this. This is what makes democracy work. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Thank you, Eduardo, for your comments and your leadership and courage in an impacted community, in a community of color. And I think your comments really highlighted just how disproportional the impacts of fossil fuels are, and the environmental racism that it has caused and continues to cause in communities of color. And I think you also touched on the relationship between local government and communities, and how across the state, on this day of action, statewide day of action, how local communities and local governments are really leading the way and showing that it's politically possible to summon the will. Over 115 local governments in California passing over 200 policies to phase out fossil fuels. We can't keep solving this climate emergency and this environmental racism community by community. We need statewide action. And I think we'll go next to one such leader who's worked at the local level, worked at the county level, Ventura County Supervisor Carmen Ramirez on our Leadership Council for Elected Officials to Protect America and California. Carmen.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to be with my colleagues here that I hear from once in a while. Eduardo, we've known each other for a long time, and your efforts for social and environmental justice are just outstanding. And I'm cheering you on. And Igor, I hear from you daily, as I am a member of that environmental caucus, and your heartfelt words really bring it home that this is a global situation, but we can each do our part where we are. For a long time, I have thought the solution, while we want to think globally, we have to act locally. Such a slogan, nothing more true than that today. I come from 10 years on the Oxnard City Council, community of color, working class, immigrant folks who were told, we're gonna put a liquefied natural gas terminal, and it's gonna be great. You're gonna get jobs. You're gonna have great energy resources. And it turns out it was dangerous. It was dirty. And there were only 17 jobs that were not going to be available to local people. And also, if there'd been a problem, it could have destroyed and killed many people. but our community fought back against the business interests that wanted it, the political interests that want it, and 2,000 people or more came to a state lands commission in 2007 and said, no, you're not going to do this to our community. These were immigrants, these were farm workers, local people, many allies across the board, from political parties to environmental groups to social justice groups. And that is the last gas-fired power plant that would ever be conceived in California on the coast. So now our community with that has really been pushing back. During my time on Oxnard City Council, we stopped a gas-fired power plant from being recommissioned to set up on our beautiful coast, which had already been burdened for 50 years with power plants serving other parts of the region. We said no. And it was a long, hard, expensive struggle, again, with certain interests really pushing it on us, not for the benefit of the community, but for the benefit of certain for-profit companies. But we showed them again, and instead of that on our beach, we now have a 100-megawatt battery storage facility in a location in an area of the community that won't affect anybody and will provide backup for the entire county for 30 minutes. That's a lot for a county of almost 1 million people. That's a lot. So we can do more. 100 megawatts a long time ago sounded like state of the art, but I know we can do better. So that's the point. We can do better if we have the political will. So I'm here just as one member of the Board of Supervisors, but I'll tell you 3 of us who are in office now have opposed a referendum to stop environmental protections that would stop environmental protections of for new and old oil drilling. And our former Board of Supervisors proposed it. And immediately after it passed, the energy companies decided they were going to do a referendum. They got the signatures by using lies, frankly. And that's what we've got to be looking out for, the lies. And now they put $5 million into a campaign to turn back environmental protections for our water, our agriculture, our health, our lives. So we have a grassroots campaign. It's called VC Safe, if you want to look at it. But, you know, I always think every time I read the headlines about the climate crisis, and they're getting more and more desperate, like red alert, humanity's last window, it's closing. We are all, and certainly individuals, but definitely elected officials, we have a responsibility to act in favor, not just of ourselves and even our children, but for the next generations, because we are going to be called to the jury of history. What did you do to prevent this? What did you do to create a clean energy future? And I hope that we are not found wanting by the future generations. I hope that we can be proud of what we did, because we, as Igor and Eduardo said, we can do this. And Heidi as well, we can do this. Don't be afraid, let's join with each other. And I think one of the things is sometimes the headlines really make you feel, if you're not really tuned in, hopeless. But that is the plan, to make us feel hopeless and paralyzed. So I want to really thank you all for providing me with hope, and for all of us working together to get to that clean energy future. I dialed up CAISO, the independent operators of the grid, and they are telling me right now at this minute, 60% of California's energy is renewable right now. And we've got to increase that. And sometimes it's even almost 80%. So yes, we can do this. We have to do our parts, elect good people like the ones you see here, and don't let people stall this effort, because it's up to us, and we're going to do that with everybody's help. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen, for your moving words, and again for your leadership over well over a decade and beyond, and as a public servant in your community and now for the entire county. And I think your comments about the courage that it takes and about how action is an antidote to despair. And that's why we have founded Elected Officials to Protect America, and in California joining together, because we do believe that elected officials it is our responsibility to steward and protect our communities. And that when a challenge like the climate emergency, like fossil fuel pollution comes along, it's up to us to provide that courage and leadership. And lastly, to your point, we can do this by joining together across municipalities at different levels of government, working together with Governor Newsom and with President Biden. We can phase out fossil fuels that are causing so much harm and geopolitical instability. So with that, thank you. Would like to open up for questions. See, a number of questions have already come in to our panelists and our speakers. The first is for Igor, and the question is, will transitioning to away from fossil fuels in California and in America, how will that help Ukraine, and how will that make a difference in the war of Russia on Ukraine?
Thank you so much for the excellent question. Again, California is really seen the nation over, the world over, really, as a bastion of climate leadership. But with that title comes a great deal of responsibility to live up to it. So right now, for instance, there is a bill in the legislature to divest public pension funds away from fossil fuels. They've already divested holdings from Russian-held corporations, but this would go beyond it to divest it from all fossil fuel adjacent entities. And to be honest with you, I called into that committee hearing. It was its first committee. There was a lot of opposition from those that stand to, I guess, those who stand to profit from it were hiding behind day-to-day members of the workforce at that hearing. And we absolutely must do everything in our power to redouble our efforts to make sure that no one is left behind. To Mayor Harmon's point, no member of the workforce can be left behind. And we also must do everything we can to protect lives, literally, to protect lives in frontline communities, to transition away from the fossil fuel industry as quickly as possible. There's a lot of power in these rooms. Why is it that at every California Public Utilities Commission meeting that I have called into for the last year, 95% of the comments are the same as what we all have said? Make rooftop solar more affordable, not less. No solar tax. Don't change the rules. Don't make it a profit grab for investor-owned utilities. Why is it that despite of those comments, they have been profoundly ignored in the proposed decisions that we have seen come out of the CPUC in the form of the Net Energy Metering 3.0 proposal, what we're seeing in the legislature now, a tax on net energy metering, a tax on local and community solar. This is not the time to be doing this, folks. The comment is here. Look up. We still have an opportunity to deflect it, but we don't have a lot of time to do it. Now is the time to unify, to show how this is done in California, that we can, in fact, invest in well-paying local jobs, invest in additional democratized and renewable energy, invest in energy freedom and democracy. If we can't do this in California, folks, there's no other place in the nation where we're going to be able to do this. And the types of attacks that I have seen here on renewable energy are part and parcel of the same kinds of national attacks by large corporations, by fossil fuel entities, and by investor-owned utilities that I have seen all over this nation. So we don't have a choice to choose energy democracy. We must do that right now, not just to protect the folks in Ukraine, but to protect our children, our grandchildren, the next generation, to protect the millions of folks in California that are at risk of asthma and other health conditions because they live in the pathway of smokestacks and indirect sources and direct sources of fossil fuel emissions. Folks, we must do this now. Let's get this done.
Thank you, Igor, for those comments. And next question that we have is that the gas industry is presenting an alternative narrative, which is that it's important to increase oil and gas production in the United States and in California right now because of Ukraine. The question particularly for Supervisor Ramirez, Carmen, because of the gas plant, in your community, the drilling happening there, how would you respond to that industry talking point?
I think that what we have to do is increase electrification of the grid, make electric vehicles more affordable, make public transit more accessible, and have zero emission vehicles. We have a big Amazon fulfillment center opening here in Oxnard. It does have some good jobs for people who don't have the skills and background to get very high paying jobs. So that is good for our community, but there is a concern about all of the vehicles. But Mr. Bezos and others who have the resources should really invest in this zero emission vehicles, not nothing else. And that goes for the post office and everybody else, because we've got to transition, we've got to do it right. Again, the window is closing. I just read the IPCC, the comments from Secretary Gutierrez about the IPCC report. He said it's a litany of broken promises, stalling, broken pledges. So this is going backwards to increase oil production. We have to, because the sacrifices today are nothing like what will happen if we don't do this. And people are trying to tell us, do it today. Don't wait till it's much harder. And who gets hurt the most? Communities of color, poor folks. So we know that natural gas is toxic in the home. That's documented. So we really just have to do what we need to do right away. Resist. Community organizing has to be to resist this propaganda, this stalling techniques, because again, the window's closing and it's up to us to keep that window open and to get through it before it closes. And that we'll need everybody's help with that. We'll need a lot of public information and education and let people know how this is going to help them. And if we don't do it, how it's going to be potentially deadly.
Thank you, Carmen, for those comments. And that's a good segue to one of our last questions, which is, speaking of deadly, to the comment that the Harvard study found that 1 in 5 deaths are caused by, globally, are caused by fossil fuels. It's a question for Eduardo, which is, how does that play out in your community? How have you seen the impacts of that? What actions have Richmond taken, and what is your message to the governor?
Well, the problem with that is that they always try to pinpoint it to a source. And because there's other factors entering in, they always make the argument that it wasn't the coal, it wasn't the oil industry, it was the traffic, or it was something else. So it makes it almost impossible for us to pin it down to them. But statistics does show that communities around refineries and coal depots have a higher rate of asthma and have a higher rate of cancer. So whereas we can't prove that was a cause, it's just common sense that when the statistics show that proximity to these places, have higher causes, then it has to be them. We have done things to, for instance, I mentioned the ban on coal and pet coke handling in the city of Richmond. There were a lot of lawsuits, but we were able to negotiate a plan so that it can be phased out slowly within 3 years. So after 3 years, there will be no pet coke or coal being handled in the city of Richmond, which also means that there won't be trains of coke of coal, coming, from far off places and leaving coal dust in communities along the rail lines. We found that we have a community, Parchester Village, which has 2 rail lines on both sides. And we had people take monitors out there and discovered that coal dust was leaving those trains and covering the community. And in terms of transition, we've passed a ordinance that requires all buildings to be 100% electricity. We were wanting to do it to all buildings in the city of Richmond, but that's something that would impact communities of color who can't afford the electrification of their buildings. So we need to find some way to make it affordable for all people. I had a meeting with people from Portland, and they came up with the idea of charging a surcharge on Chevron, a business tax surcharge, which could be used to work towards a just transition. I've also tried to work on industrial risk bonds and found that, my hands at the local level and our hands at the county level are basically tied up, and we can't do that. We found out that Chevron can self-insure themselves against damages. And we know how good that insurance is, as we saw it in Philadelphia when Marathon had their explosion and they shut the plant down and left the mess for the population to clean up. But we keep charging on and trying to come up with new ways to make sure that we can protect our citizens.
Great, thank you, Eduardo. And one last question, and I see that Heidi is back. So Heidi, I'll give you 2 questions. You could choose one or both to answer, which was, what is your message to the governor? And also, particularly when it comes to setbacks in oil and gas drilling, the governor has, as you all know, has issued a 3,200 foot proposal setbacks on new wells from neighborhood drilling. And the question is, what is your message to the governor as it regards to existing wells?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Okay.
Yes.
I'm sure it was raucous earlier, so I don't know how well that went, but my number one message is that we need to keep it in the ground, and that we need to stop all permitting, period, right? And that it gets a little complicated when you're also at the same time advocating for setbacks on all new wells, which is already in process. So that's absolutely necessary if there's going to be new wells. But I think most of us, certainly most of us here, but most of the folks in the state of California don't want that. They really understand that we are on the front lines of a lot of climate impacts in the state of California, and that we need leadership that takes a bold stance on that and says no to the fossil fuel industry and yes to the future of this state. And so ultimately, I'm hopeful that Governor Newsom will commit to no fossil fuel permits. But if there are to be permits, absolutely setbacks. And we have a lot of cascading challenges around existing infrastructure of all types. Electrification was mentioned. So we in San Luis Obispo have already committed to policies around no toxic methane gas in new buildings. But our city and many others are going to also at some point have to address the existing housing infrastructure, which is a challenge. And the same is true for existing wells. So absolutely working with a lot of folks, especially in the environmental justice community in this state, to say that those folks in those communities that are experiencing these pollution impacts as particulate impacts firsthand absolutely deserve to have those projects set back away from their homes and away from their schools. And it's a policy, it's a land use policy essentially rooted in a long history of racism in this state and in this country, where, as was noted, folks in Black and Brown communities are experiencing those impacts, and that is just totally unacceptable. So no to fossil fuel minutes, period. And where they exist already, that those setbacks need to be in place to ensure the public health of those communities.
Great, thank you, Heidi. And one last question for you: how the rally was, as this was part of the statewide day of action that's happening across the state. How did it go?
I thought it was great. We had a small-ish crowd, which I kind of expected. I think people are, COVID's still having an impact, but we got people out. We got a little core group of organizers going again, and that was one of the intentions, to kind of brush off our protest signs and our organizing expertise and get that ball rolling again. So I would anticipate this to be the first of a series of events that we will continue to do until we solve climate change. So we'll probably be doing them for a while. We did have what appeared to be some sort of fossil fuel oriented truck show up and have their engine going the whole time. I can't say with any certainty that that was intentional, but it felt intentional. So.
Well, thank you for the report on the ground. So with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists, invite them to stay on for a minute. And to conclude the press conference, again, this is Elected Officials Protect California, calling across the state, elected officials thanking Governor Newsom for his climate leadership, comments on oil and gas and the steps he has taken to phase out fossil fuel production, and a request to step up the urgency with no new permits for oil and gas drilling and 3,200 setbacks, both on new and existing drilling, to protect communities and our climate. So with that, thank you to everyone, and we ask the panelists to stay on for a few minutes afterwards.